All right, well, this morning we are reading in the Gospel of Matthew, and for those just joining us, we've been reading through Matthew beginning at chapter 1, verse 1, word 1, all the way through the end is where we'll go. And today we find ourselves in Matthew chapter 16, and I'm going to be reading from verse 13 and following. But before I read it, I just want again just to let you know, as you hear these words from Matthew 16, this is a very pivotal moment in Matthew's story. This is what some would call sort of that turning point moment in the gospel, where the true identity of Jesus is revealed, and he lets his disciples in on what is going to take place. And so Matthew chapter 16, beginning at verse 13. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Peter, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then Jesus sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, and he must undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." But Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Then Jesus told his disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly I tell you," Jesus said, "there are some standing here who will not taste death before the Son of Man see the Son of Man coming into his kingdom." And so may God add a blessing to the reading of God's word today. This morning, and what I wanted to share with you for our time together in the sermon is this understanding today of the cross. And what I wanted to begin with today is just highlight the story of a young man whose name and life I have become aware of. Actually, it was an article in Sports Illustrated that had come out, and this young man named Logan Boulet, who was a tough and rugged and very committed hockey player. He grew up in Canada, in a small town. I guess if you're in Canada, the only thing to do is to take up hockey for young folks. And so he was a young man who played hockey and had dreams of being a professional hockey player. And in fact, he was drafted by a junior league team named the Humboldt Broncos, who were a team out of this small town up in Saskatchewan. And they had the great support of this farming community, the Humboldt Broncos. So Logan was playing for them and, again, had hopes of someday reaching to levels of the NHL. But it's kind of ironic, in the summer of 2017, Logan told his father out of the blue, a 21-year-old kid, said to his father, "Dad, if something ever happens to me, I want you to donate my organs." His father was struck that a 20-year-old would say such a thing. And he said to his son, "Logan, I don't think they're going to want the organs of an 80-year-old man." Again, the hopes of how long his son would live. But Logan said back to his father, he said, "Well, Dad, just so you know, I'm okay if I die. And I want you to share my organs because you could save the lives of others." And so again, it was a conversation that his father found to be quite troubling, but yet also soothing, that his son would be so conscientious. One thing that his family says about Logan is he always put others before himself. He always thought about the well-being of other people, even his own teammates, which is why he had become the team captain. So, of course, I will confess that you often will hear stories about organ donation from this pulpit, again, because yours truly is a double lung transplant recipient. But you know, organ donation doesn't stop here. It also travels over there, where Jody Boone, who serves on Journey of Faith's board, donated her kidney to her sister. In fact, her niece, Ashley, is here, who that is her mother, who received the kidney. So if you need a kidney, don't go to Jody, because she's only got one left, and she kind of needs it now. But again, there is a story here in this congregation about the power and the beauty of organ donation. And not just that, I often speak about organ donation because for me, there may be no other image or any other way for me to communicate to anyone else how God takes life out of death, how God takes triumph out of tragedy and trauma, and how God assures us that God is with us in times of suffering and times of great loss. Because really that's what is before us today that can be somewhat troubling and for us to read in the stories that Jesus shares right now, when he communicates to his disciples. But I hope again that we understand that life is a gift from God. And life is precious. And life continues on beyond this life right here. You know, someone had commented to me that they noticed that when I take communion, and maybe you have seen it also, but before I take communion, I will put my hands right here on my chest, on my lungs, and I take a little breath. And the reason I do that is I try to remind myself before I receive communion that every breath of life is pure grace and love. But really, it's not just for me that every breath is pure grace and love, but for all of us. Every breath you take is pure grace and love given from God. And that's again reassured here by Jesus and what he says to us and says to his disciples. How Jesus today in the lesson mentions for the first time in Matthew's gospel this understanding of the cross. The cross, that symbol or emblem of suffering and shame. The cross, that was the place where death was sure to occur. But it's important to understand that the identity of Jesus is wrapped up in the cross. In fact, if you don't have the cross, you don't have the crucifixion. If you don't have the crucifixion, you don't have the resurrection. If you don't have the resurrection, then all you have is a pretty cool guy who has some nice teachings about how you ought to live your life. But instead, we have the words from the one who has overcome death and the grave. And just as Jesus' life is wrapped up in the cross, his identity, so is the identity of Jesus' followers. So is our identity to be wrapped up as well. So Jesus had turned his disciples and he said to them, "Hey, tell me, what's the buzz?" Right? That's from Jesus Christ Superstar. What's the buzz? What are people saying about me? What are they posting on Facebook about me, right? What are other folks saying about me? And they answered, of course, some are saying you're Elijah. Some say you're John the Baptist, come back because John had died. Some are saying this and that. And then Jesus stops and says, okay, that's fine what they're saying about me. But then he says what? What do you say about me? Who do you say I am? And of course, it's no surprise, I think, for those who were with us last week with Peter, who was the first and only one to step out of the boat. Peter's the first one to open his mouth. And Peter says what? You are what? You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. I mean, after they'd witnessed, they had seen enough, right? After they witnessed Jesus cleanse a leper with his leprous skin, after they saw Jesus open, like Visine, open the eyes of a man born blind, after they saw Jesus heal a woman who had suffered from an issue of blood, after they saw Jesus take a man who was paralyzed and his spine was unraveled like spaghetti and give him the power to stand again, after they saw Jesus feed 5,000 people with just a couple of breadcrumbs and fish nuggets, after they saw Jesus moonwalk across the water, right, after they saw Jesus stop the storm right in his tracks, after they saw all they saw, Peter says, wait a minute, I know exactly who you are. You are the Messiah. Now, interestingly enough, the actual word there in Greek, I put it there for you, what he actually says is you are the Christos, which is where we get the word Christ. Come on, it's not that difficult, right? Christ comes from Christos, which, quick timeout lesson time, Jesus' last name was not Christ. On his driver's license, didn't say Jesus Christ. In fact, his name was Jesus, son of Joseph, Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph, son of Mary. Christ was not his name. Christ was the title, the identity given to him. Christ was who he was. And so for those of you who mention his first name and his last name, whenever you get upset, right, realize it's not his name. In fact, my son one time, he had fallen or done something else, and I heard him say, Jesus Christ, right? And I said, Zach, don't say that. And he said, why, Dad? It's Jesus. Come here, man. Let me talk to you for a minute. Because, again, Christ is his title and what Peter acknowledges about him and all he's seen. So Peter says, you are the Messiah. Now, it's important for us today, I think, to understand just what Peter was thinking. And what I really want us to unpack a little bit today is what does it mean for us today? See, when Peter said, you are the Messiah, you are the Christos, or again, they read the word Meshiach. When you are the Messiah, there was some real understandings of what the Messiah was going to do and what he was going to accomplish. And the idea of Messiah actually began thousands of years ago in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 7. It was God who promised to King David before David died. He said to David that, David, someday I will establish your kingdom forever. That someday you will have a descendant who will take your throne and reign for all eternity. And so for thousands of years, it was the anticipation that God would send a Messiah. Now, lest we forget, and I've said this a few times, we must never forget Jesus' own context and when he lived and when he taught. Jesus, again, was a first century Palestinian Jew. And as a first century Palestinian Jew, guess who Jesus grew up with? First century Palestinian Jews. That's who he grew up with. Guess who the crew was he hung out with? First century, come on, y'all, it's easy again, right? First century Palestinian Jews. And guess who? He grew, his crew that he hung with, and then those who drew upon the experience of him and wrote the 4 Gospels were also first century Palestinian Jews. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They're all those that had come out from a certain time and place. And it's, again, difficult for us to sometimes understand what Jesus was saying then because of how and where we live now. Because I don't think, as I look around today, that there are any first century Palestinian Jews here today, unless somebody was alive back then. So how do we take what was meant then to understand it in today's language, in today's vision, in today's place? Because for the Jews, for Jesus and his parents, and Jesus and his friends, for Jesus and the community in which they grew up in, again, for thousands of years, they've been praying for this Messiah. And it's so critical to understand that when we read Scripture from Genesis to Revelation, to understand that the Jewish people were constantly living under the oppression of a greater military power. From the beginning, it was the Egyptians, and then it goes from the Egyptians down to the Persians, then from the Persians to the Babylonians, then from the Babylonians to the Assyrians, then from the Nebo to the to the Greeks. But while there were respites in between, most of all Scripture is written from the standpoint of people who were under incredible oppression. Written from people who understood what it was to be kicked around and what it meant to be humiliated, what it meant to be denied access and rights and privileges. That was the story of the Jewish people, though. But for generation after generation, they prayed, they fasted, they praised, and they prayed for God to send the Messiah. And the Messiah who was to be sent will be a Messiah like David, who will be a Messiah who had political, economic, and military power. So that all those who've been kicking us around, we can what? Do some kicking ourselves. It's the whole displacement. You know, when you've been kicked around enough, you want to find someone you can what? Kick. It's like when the boss yells at the wife, and the wife yells at her husband, and the husband yells at the daughter yells at the son, and the son kicks the dog. It's displacement. And so what deeply was part of the prayer was that God would send forth a Messiah so that those who have been humiliating, who've been experiencing humiliation from, we can turn and have some domination over. They wanted to have the anointed one who could be the appointed one to turn, again, our humiliation into domination, turn our liberation into their subjugation, take our suffering, make it their suffering, that we can do unto others as they for thousands of years have been doing unto us. We're waiting for this Messiah who would be about retribution of our enemies, to perpetuate a cycle of dominance over somebody else. That was the hope. That was the Messiah they were looking for. So when Peter says, "You are the Messiah," Peter has some understandings back behind that. And Peter was basically saying, we're ready now to go and do what we need to do, Jesus. But here's again where Jesus messes everything up. And that's what you'll find following God, how it's not easy. And what's amazing is Jesus already told them, again, we talked about this weeks ago, on the Sermon on the Mount, he told them that you've heard it said to hate your enemies. But Jesus said, but I tell you to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Jesus already told them that God asks for us to do unto others, not as they've done unto you, but what? As you would have them do. He's already told them what was going to be done, and just the hope was maybe he didn't really mean it. Because when Jesus now, that they've said, this is who you are, Jesus says, fine, let me let you in on what's going to happen now. Because now he says what? I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be betrayed. I'll be arrested. I'll be beaten. and I'm going to die. And Peter says what? Heck no. That's not happening, Jesus. Because that's not what the Messiah is supposed to do. I love how Peter, again, last week he stepped out of the boat. So Peter stepped his foot out of the boat to walk on water. Then, of course, he confessed or professed Jesus the Messiah, so he opened his mouth to speak his faith. And then the last thing he does is he opened his mouth to put his foot in it, right? When he says, no, Jesus, that's not going to happen. And then Jesus comes back in with, okay, Satan. So again, this revelation Jesus makes, and this is why I just want to hang out with a minute, because I think it's so hard. Again, I'm going to confess to you, it's hard for me. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around this understanding that Jesus gives back then, 2,000 years ago, and I think it's even more difficult today. Because Jesus also doesn't just say that he's the one to go to the cross. He also says to them and says to us that we also, if anyone to become our followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. And see, I'm not so sure on March 10th, 2019, that we can even really quite comprehend that. I'm confessing to you today that my confession is I have it difficult. I have difficulty really living out and understanding what this cross is. What does Jesus mean? Because this is, again, a centerpiece. This is the critical. Jesus says, now you know who I am. Let me let you into the biggest understanding of what it means to follow me is to take up your cross and follow me. I mean, I'm born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, raised in Cleveland, Ohio, and as bad of a rap as Cleveland gets, so it's not a bad place to live. Just don't have a good football team, but I grew up here in the United States of America. I grew up here, and I have never quite had to deal with, I've dealt with hardship in my life, and personally, I've been mistreated. Personally, I've known difficulties. Personally, I've had uncertainties. But as a heterosexual white male, I have never had to face what many other people have had to face as far as a system, and as far as disenfranchisement and having to legitimize one's own existence and identity, as groups in this country do it and groups in other countries have to do. Again, I've had a hard life, I've been through some stuff. But as far as having the identity under oppression like Jesus and other Jews had then and many people have today, and where does the cross fit in that conversation? That's a difficult one for us to often understand. Because I've seen how oppression works, how systems work against certain communities and certain people and groups of people. I've seen how it works. I know a woman who, in middle management of this company, got a call from her son. He was locked out of the house. It was during a snowstorm, and he couldn't get in the house. So she said to her boss, I have to go let my son into his house. And the boss said, why you got to leave? We have a meeting come up. You don't need to leave. Just tell your son to climb in through a window. And she said, you don't understand. She said, my son's a 14-year-old black kid. You know what happens when you're seen climbing in through a window by a neighbor? When you're a 14-year-old black kid? And the boss said, I'm sorry. And she went home to let her son in. Or I know, again, as my gay and lesbian brothers and sisters share with me, how oftentimes, as God has created them, they're found in places where they have to continually come out. It's like they're always coming out to people. They always have to come out to someone, not knowing how that person receive who they are, but they have to always come out. Do you know how many times I had to come out that I'm a heterosexual guy? I've never had to say it because it's already. So again, this understanding of the cross is difficult, and especially growing up again in the United States where, the United States is always about being top dog and being first and not knowing what it is to be last. And so that's part of why this understanding Jesus is saying to us, it can be difficult, I'll just say for me, to wrap my mind around, really understand what is Jesus saying to us about this identity, about will you carry the cross? Do you bear the cross? Because there's two understandings of the cross today. We all can know personal suffering. We all can know the cross from a personal experience. We all can know that we have illness. We all have difficulty. We all have financial difficulties in life. We all can know personal suffering. Every one of us can have that. Everyone. And we all do. I know those of us here who have illnesses, diseases we battle with and deal with. And the cross is about that. God meets us in our suffering. I hope you find that in the suffering of disease and the suffering of illness, the cross tells us that God is there. But the hard thing is that's not the only cross or the only understanding of the cross for us to take up. But there's also the understanding the cross is what you take up for the sake of others who are suffering. The cross is for those who've already been marginalized and put aside and have no voice. And you know that when you're going to speak up for them, you are going to put your life on the line. That's what Jesus is saying here. That the cross is heavy to carry. It's hard, but yet together we must carry it, he says, just as he goes the cross as well. Not that we could, and Jesus doesn't go so one group could be dominating over another. Jesus doesn't go to the cross for domination. Jesus goes to the cross for restoration. For us all to be able to come together and be together. That's the cross. Again, we grew up with more and more and more. We need more. More power, more wealth, more influence, and often done in the name of God, where political leaders are autographing Bibles as if we wrote it. It's God's word, not ours. And it gets dangerous for us because the cross stands against our desire for more. You know, I got in the mail the other day, and I struggled with this. A letter from the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, sent me a letter. And on the letter it says, "Are you prepared for retirement?" And I went and checked. No way. I'm nowhere near prepared for retirement. But then I thought, wait a minute. That's the church asking me, do I need more? And I have to say, as a pastor, is that what I'm alive for retirement? Is that the calling of Christ, that I would live in such a way that someday I could just retire? I'm conflicted with that. When the church puts aside the cross and asks for me to be worried about what happens later to make sure I stay alive because I saved up for this moment. And that's what happens in our own understanding of the cross. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said this. I leave you with this today. Perhaps no one understood the cross like Dr. King. And he said, there might be others who want to go another way, but when I took up the cross, I recognized its meaning. It's not just something you merely put your hands on. It's not something you wear. The cross is something that you bear, and ultimately something you die on. If you never found something so dear and so precious that you're willing to die for it, then you aren't fit to live. You may be 38 years old, as I happen to be, and one day some great principle, some great opportunity stands before you and calls upon you to stand up for some great issue, for some great cause. And you refuse to do it because you want to live longer. You're afraid that you will lose your job, or you're afraid you'll be criticized, or that you'll lose your popularity, or you're afraid that somebody will stab you or shoot you or possibly bomb your house. So you refuse to take a stand. Well, Dr. King says, you may go on and live until you're 90 years old, but you're just as dead at 38 as you'll be at 90. And the cessation of breathing in your life is but the belated announcement of an earlier death of your soul. You died when you refused to stand up for righteousness. You died when you refused to stand up for truth. You died when you refused to stand up for justice. And see, again, the cross is what we carry for one another, to uplift one another, and especially those who the world has forgotten, those the world has pushed out, those the world has pushed down. The cross allows us to live for a greater cause than just ourselves. The cross calls us to live without worry and with joy. The cross calls us to stand up against injustice, and no matter how hard things get, to never lose hope. Because while the cross is a place of death, you also find out the cross is a place of life. Because God meets us there. And God takes death and pushes aside to bring out life. So I began this morning talking about this young man named Logan Boulay, who at 21 years old spoke to his parents about his death, always tried to put others before himself, and who always sought for ways to help someone as he went along through life. And so in July 2017, he told his father, "Dad, if something ever happens to me, donate my organs." Well, unfortunately, on April the 6th, 2018, and you may have seen this story in the news, Logan was part of a hockey team in Canada that was struck. The bus that carried them, the players and coaches, was hit by a semi-truck that ran the stop sign. And unfortunately, when the semi, as it hit the bus, 16 people were killed. 3 coaches and the rest players. And it was Logan himself who the paramedics found, who seemed to be fine, actually, who was still breathing. And they took him to the hospital, and upon inspection, he almost didn't even have a scratch on his body. What they found out, though, is in the accident, he had so been scrambled inside the bus that his spine had been severed, his neck had been broken, and his brain had been traumatized. That in essence, he was brain dead. And so when his parents got to the emergency room, the doctors explained to them that there's nothing else we can do, that he will never live again, he'll never walk, he'll never wake up from this. The doctor said, though, it is a miracle that his heart is still beating. We can't believe he's still alive, but he is. But there's nothing else we could do. And Logan's mother turned to the doctor and said, "Well, is it possible that we could donate his organs?" And the doctor said, yes. And so the next day, actually on April 7, 2018, they were able to take from Logan his heart, his lungs, his kidneys, his liver, his pancreas, and his corneas. And 7 people benefited. 7 lives were saved from Logan's death. But it doesn't stop there. Canada actually had one of the lowest rates of organ donor, those who sign up to be organ donors. But Logan's story went viral. And today, what has been called the Logan Boulay effect, that now in Canada, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands or more organ donors, people willing to donate their organs because of the act of this one young man. And so again, you can see what God does, how God with death, how God with the cross, though we may be afraid to take stands, we might be afraid of what death brings, what the cross assures us today is that from the cross comes life. From the cross comes God. From the cross is where God meets us through God's Son, Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, who died to set us free. Amen. Amen.